My name is Timothy Gianotti, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the American Islamic College. And it is our great pleasure tonight to partner with Roosevelt University and with the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the University of Notre Dame for this really, in some ways, historic book launch. We also want to acknowledge and thank the Indian American Muslim Council, the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, Hindus for Human Rights, South Asian American Coalition to Renew Democracy, and the Sikh Coalition for partnering with us in this event tonight. The American Islamic College and Roosevelt University, this is our very first formal collaboration. And it's a collaboration that we hope and pray will give rise to many more collaborations. There is a synergy between these two institutions that I think we need to acknowledge and we need to celebrate. Roosevelt University was established, in the 1940s because of the exclusion and discrimination that was rampant in American higher education. And so the values of social justice, inclusivity, accessibility to higher education, and the refusal to allow politics to dominate and to dictate the free intellectual discourse and research that happens in our universities. These are values that have been safeguarded by Roosevelt University for now half a century or more. And the American Islamic College similarly seeks to welcome Muslims from all parts of the Muslim mosaic, as well as the wider society, in a quest for knowledge, for wisdom, for all that gives life and ennobles us. And so we are thrilled to have tonight serve as our very first formal collaboration, and we are looking forward to many more collaborations, inshallah, as we go forward. So with that, let me just thank you all for being here. I want to thank our author and thank our respondents, and I look forward to an evening of free, respectful, and illuminating conversation, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Timothy. I just want to have a quick, not correction, but we changed the time. So we actually were only 2 minutes late, so not too bad, not too bad. Welcome everybody. My name is Mahan Mirza. I'm the Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, which is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And this year I'm serving as Visiting Vice President at American Islamic College in Chicago. And so this event is a kind of collaboration between the two, with me serving as what they're calling the living bridge. So it's a tremendous honor to be here with you in this collaboration, and also thank you to all the co-sponsors who have been mentioned, as well as Roosevelt University for hosting us in their wonderful space. We are really excited to see all of you here to celebrate Audrey Truschke's latest book, India, 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent, published by Princeton University Press. The official publication date for the book is June 3rd, the day after tomorrow. We are fortunate to have advanced copies available for purchase after the program, and I think many of you have already purchased your book. Make sure to get the signature. In addition, we are delighted to welcome two distinguished scholars of religion to be in conversation with Professor Truschke, Anantanand Rambachan and R. David Coolidge, one of Hindu background, the other Muslim. I'll introduce them in a bit more detail when the time comes. We are meeting at a time of intense regional tension in South Asia. On April 22nd, terrorists gunned down 26 innocent tourists in Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir. On May 7th, after blaming Pakistan for sheltering and even grooming the perpetrators of the Pahalgam attack, India struck targets deep inside Pakistan, resulting in the rapid escalation of military conflict between the two countries. What is the historical significance of this flare-up? Is it a prelude to a major war, or will it be forgotten as another mere footnote in the annals of history. Professor Truschke's book was already in print when the conflict erupted. But had she written the book 10 years from now, would she have mentioned the incident in a 5,000-year history of India? The book's afterword is titled Now. So after going through 5,000 years, she has an afterword titled Now, and that gives us a clue. I failed to mention, she writes, that Pakistan became a nuclear power in 1998. India and Pakistan fought over Kashmir in the 1999 Kargil conflict. Nepalese overthrew their Hindu monarchy in 2008, and the Sri Lankan civil war ended in 2009. End of quote. You see, historians have to make choices. Some of them even view the present moment as a moment of future history, so as if they're living in a history of the future. We are not the end point of history, nor its culmination, writes Professor Truschke. Yet others have written, and she observes, and she quotes them, that the present is all that there is. So there's a humbling aspect to these perspectives, which I find to be spiritual in nature, even though they are topics of the philosophy of history. Professor Truschke constructively engages the tension between past, present, and future throughout her book. How narratives of the past shape the present, how the present also shapes the past, together influencing the kind of future we imagine and ultimately co-create. Another tension wonderfully engaged in the book is between the past as constructed by a historian and the past as viewed through the lens of what we call sacred history. It is daunting to write a 5,000-year history of a land as ancient, as diverse, and as global as India. It is next to impossible to do so compellingly and, might I say, engagingly. Professor Truschke has defied the odds by using India's cosmopolitan variety in religion, language, and geography, and culture overall as its unifying characteristic. And she writes, diversity itself provides a kind of unifying glue. For this reason, I suspect tonight's conversation will be as engaging as it might be for some unsatisfying. As long as it keeps us coming back for more and encourages you to read the book, that's a win. Here's how we will proceed. First, Audrey will say a few words on how to think about her book in 12 to 15 minutes. Then I'll invite Anand and David to each speak for about 7 to 8 minutes, responding to the book and framing questions for discussion. The panel, the four of us, will then have a conversation between us for about maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to the audience for question and answers. And this whole sequence should last for about 2 hours until roughly 7:30. And after the formal program concludes, Audrey will be available in the back to sign the book, and the book will be available for purchase. We have a very distinguished audience in the room, including diplomats, and I'd like to recognize the Consul General for his gracious presence of Pakistan. Thank you for coming out. He's actually an academic, and this is not an official kind of state visit. He's genuinely interested in the academic questions that are raised by scholars such as Audrey, and in the conversation we'll engage in. Each of us is situated either with a professional set of obligations or as individuals passionately committed to our own stories of the past with which we make sense of the present. You will have time to ask questions, have the courage to share your perspective, but also take the time to carefully listen to others. Take a few deep breaths if you find yourself getting too excited. We are about to enter a journey of lands and cultures, both strange yet familiar. If our encounter is genuine, it will be self-transformative. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming and look forward to the conversation. With that, let me introduce our guest of honor. Dr. Audrey Truschke is a professor and Asian Studies Director at Rutgers University. She publishes broadly on cross-cultural exchanges, historical memory, and imperial power, focusing on the region and languages of South Asia. Her first 3 books are titled Culture of Encounters, Aurangzeb, The Life and Legacy of India's Most Controversial King, and most recently, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule. For those interested in her activism as well as her public-facing work, including podcasts and articles, visit her website, audreytruschke.com. Audrey and I ran into each other last summer at the House of Missions over breakfast at the Chautauqua Institute in New York. That is where we initially discussed the possibility of hosting this launch in Chicago. And what do you know it? Here we are. Please join me in welcoming Professor Audrey Truschke.
Thank you so much to Mahan for that very kind introduction. A warm welcome to everyone who has come out today. I'm thrilled to see you all here. This event is special to me for a couple of different reasons, but I want to tell you just one, which is that it's actually kind of a homecoming. I am from Chicago's northwest suburbs. I was born about 10 miles from here. Now, I'm from a Chicago Polish family, if you ever wondered where the surname came from. That's where, all right? And nobody in my family ever dreamed that I would grow up to study India or South Asia. Okay, we have no family connections to that region of the world. But life happens. And I still remember when I was 18 years old as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, again, not all that far from where we are, when I fell intellectually head over heels in love with pre-modern South Asia. And so I called my parents and I told them this. I said, I'm enthralled with India. I think Hinduism's really interesting. In fact, Mom and Dad, I'm going to learn Sanskrit. My father was completely speechless, and that man was never speechless. He asked what Sanskrit was. I explained, ancient Indian language. Okay. At some point, I forget if it was that conversation or later, my father asked me, Audrey, how do you think that learning Sanskrit will prepare you for law school? My father was a lawyer. He assumed and hoped that I would go to law school. In the end, I married an attorney, so Dad was satisfied on that front. But as for me, I remain enthralled with pre-modern India. It has become and remains today, and I think will always remain, the defining intellectual curiosity of my adult life, manifest in this new book. Now, I wrote this book, India, 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent, as a book about real people and real events. It's a record of about a quarter of the world's population and how they've lived and changed over time. That might sound like kind of a banal statement, and it kind of is, but you all may have noticed that some people seem to think that we are living in a post-truth world. Maybe other people are, I don't know, but I am not. History makes a claim to accuracy about the past. That's what makes it an essential subject to study, that we're telling real stories about real people. It's also what gives the discipline of history some teeth and makes it a little upsetting to some folks. Now, of course, I am not the first and only scholar to write an overarching, sweeping history of India, although I am the first to do so in a little while. Moreover, I do a couple of things differently than other historians. And so in my brief introductory remarks with you all today, what I want to do is highlight just a handful of things that sort of set my book, My India, apart from how South Asian history has been told before. The first is that pre-modernity, pre-modern South Asian history is the core of the book. A full 2/3 of my India book, 16 out of 24 chapters, concern events before about 1750. So before British colonialism, more or less. This is appropriate. Since I'm covering about 4,600 years of history in the book, all right, we rounded up to 5,000 years for the title, because publishers like round numbers. But most of the last 4,600 years, of course, was pre-modernity. Now, of course, I tell some of the expected narratives of pre-modern South Asia. For example, I talk about the Indus Valley Civilization, India's first city builders in what's now largely Pakistan. The India of the book does refer to the whole subcontinent, to historic India, not only the modern nation. I talk about the Vedic peoples, who were peripatetic, they moved around a lot, and they emphasized ritual sacrifice as their core religious activity. I go over the dawn of Buddhism, one of the most popular religions worldwide today. I talk about King Ashoka, with his famous inscriptions and his promise of non-violence. Critically, a promise he made after using a lot of violence to win himself a very large Mauryan empire. I discussed the rise of Sanskrit literature, the Chola dynasty, Mughal artistic and imperial culture, and far more. All of that stuff any historian would include in a book like this. But because I give pre-modernity the space it deserves, I'm also able to work in some lesser told stories. These include jewelry fashions, such as the etchings on carnelian beads and their designs, how they shifted over time and space, going back thousands of years. I talk about the dawn, the flourishing, and the extinction of the Ajivikas, a religious group that most of you have probably never heard of, unless you've heard of me talk about them before, because they went extinct in the 13th century. But they used to be really popular. They rivaled the early Buddhists. I discussed the establishment of the Silk Road and the sea trade routes, including how ancient Indians and Sri Lankans sailed the high seas. I discussed the moralistic animal fable stories of the Panchatantra, which proved to be one of pre-modern India's most famous cultural exports. I discussed various kinds of slavery in pre-modern India, Bengali conversion to Islam in the 17th century, and a whole lot more. Now, in these basically lists that I just gave you of sort of must-tell events and lesser-told stories, there are some things that most people would say are good, virtuous parts of history, things of which South Asians can be proud, like the Indus civilization and being the birthplace of Buddhism. There are other things that I hope no modern person would claim with pride, like slavery. History is chock full of horrible things and sublime things. But here's the rub, and this is a second key point in my book, which is that the sublime and the horrific often go together. The things we love are often linked with the things we despise, and this can be hard for people to admit at times. For example, many celebrate the flourishing of Sanskrit poetry and plays in the first millennium CE, with the likes of Ashvaghosha, Kalidasa, Dundan, and others. Fewer people want to hear about how this literary excellence was financed by increased social stratification, as untouchability became part of the caste system in the same period, and Hindu women, especially widows, faced rising restrictions. Similarly, the Chola dynasty in southern India sponsored the construction of bronze statues of Hindu deities, favorites in art museums today, as well as skyscraping Hindu temples to house those images, some of the tallest buildings anywhere worldwide in their times. Those same temples, which spark awe and religiosity in visitors even today, they were also sites of slavery, where the poor in the 12th and 13th centuries sold themselves, their children, even their grandchildren, into lives of servitude, even physical abuse, to avoid starvation. Now, people no longer sell themselves to temples, and in fact, a lot has changed from pre-modern India, which is my third and kind of final point. Namely, that a lot of things that are definitional now in modern South Asia were absent in pre-modernity. Most notably, for many modern people, Hindu-Muslim conflict, a major feature of subcontinental life today, it just wasn't much of a thing in pre-modern India. On the contrary, pre-modern Hindus and Muslims shared a lot in common. And I showcase this at multiple points in the book. For example, I have a chapter on the long 15th century. So starting in sort of the mid-1300s, going into the early 1500s. And in that chapter, I address the Bahmani and Vijayanagara kingdoms in central and southern India, largely in tandem. I talk about their trade relations with each other, their similarly diverse populations, how their royal families intermarried, and their quite similar land grant practices. The Bahmani and Vijayanagara rulers even dressed the same. They both wanted to be known as sultans, despite the Vijayanagara rulers being Hindus in modern terms. Another example of something shared between Hindus and Muslims is temple desecration and destruction. Targeting the temples of one's political enemies was a practice for about 1,000 years in pre-modern India. Today, many associate it with Muslim-led dynasties, but actually it was Hindu rulers who invented and popularized this idea of desecrating temples to make a political statement. Hundreds of years later, when Muslim rulers showed up in India, they simply followed the Hindus' lead. By way of conclusion, let me warn you that history is not for the faint of heart. And partly, that's because we cannot change it. Narrating the past, it's not like writing fiction or composing poetry, all right, or writing mythology. You don't get to craft it as you want. With history, you only get to recover it and tell it in an unvarnished fashion. Now, I am very clear on my ethical responsibilities to be honest about and thereby honor the dead. But what about the living? My guess is that many people who read this new book will find parts that make them feel uneasy. And I'm afraid that I have somewhat cold comfort to offer to those folks. My cold comfort is that I guarantee you can live with those feelings of unease, because I do it every single day. What I have a harder time communicating, I think, is the intense satisfaction and even joy that I get from engaging with and sharing Indian history, even the skeletons in the closet. South Asian and Indian histories are gloriously complicated, diverse, and nuanced. There's more than a little of my passion for the past in the pages of the book, and if even a small bit of that rubs off on the reader, then I am thrilled. I very much look forward to our discussion today with my esteemed panelists, and after that, with you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Audrey. We're going to have remarks from our panel, beginning with Anantanand Rambachan. Dr. Rambachan is Professor Emeritus at St. Olaf College and one of the world's leading scholars of philosophical Hinduism, focusing on its ethical teachings for the world today. Among his many writings is the Advaita worldview, God, world, and humanity, and another work on a Hindu theology of liberation. Professor Rambachan is an active practitioner of interreligious dialogue. He's been doing this for about 3 decades, and he serves as co-president of Religions for Peace in the United States. On a personal note, it's been an absolute joy to come to know him as a close and trusted advisor of the Ansari Institute over the past 3 years. And with that, please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest, Professor Anantanand Rambachan.
Thank you very much, Mahan, for your kind words and for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today. It was also very special, it is a very special joy for me also to reconnect with my friend, Dr. Gianotti, after quite a few years. So this gives me very special joy today. I want to begin by, of course, congratulating Audrey and expressing my own appreciation for her meticulous work of research, writing, and documentation that culminated in this significant publication. Her passionate love for Indian history is on full display on every page. I think you will understand that a few comments will not do justice to Audrey's work or offer the kind of detailed analysis that a study of 5,000 years of history deserves. So I will limit my remarks to a few selective themes treated by Audrey, guided by my own identity as a theologian and as a practitioner of the Hindu tradition. Let me say, of course, how much I appreciate the focus that she gives to religious history throughout her work. She gives attention not only to the religious beliefs and practices of those who enjoy power and prestige, but also offers space to the voices of the marginalized and excluded groups. And I think this is a very special feature of Audrey's work as a historian. As far as religion and history are concerned, the task of the historian is not to assess the truth or the falsity of religious claims. A historian may help us to date a particular text or teaching, compare earlier versions of this teaching with subsequent ones. So Audrey, for example, tells us that karma in the early Vedas referred more to ritual action. In the Upanishads, karma refers more to a moral law governing all actions and results. The historian cannot tell us if such a universal law is true or not. And in a similar way, as far as the Hindu tradition is concerned, it is not the purpose of a sacred text or teaching to divulge or to dispute historical facts established through empirical methods of inquiry. History is the business of the historian with her empirical methods of inquiry. So I think that mutual respect and humility between the historian and the theologian makes for a really good relationship. So when I look at Audrey's documentation of Indian religious history, I want to very briefly lift up 3 themes that occurred throughout her work. The first is the fact of an ancient and rich diversity. This diversity includes the traditions preserved in the Vedas, but as Audrey mentioned, Buddhism, Jainism, the Ajivikas, the Charvakas, and so on. And as we move through history, this diversity came to include the Shaivas, those who worship goddess Shiva, the Vaishnavas, focusing on goddess Vishnu, and the Shaktas, focusing on the divine feminine, as well as, of course, indigenous traditions, yoga and Tantra. And then you have around 75 CE, the Jews, and in the 7th century, Muslims, Parsis who follow Zoroastrian, Christians, and then Sikhism in the 15th century. And what we speak of today as Hinduism itself is a family of traditions rather than a single homogeneous religion. So that's the first point, diversity. Second, although we like to think of our religions as fixed, unchanging, and immune to historical influences, the fact is that our traditions are dynamic and not static. Religions are more like flowing rivers than rocks, and they change as they flow through the landscape. But they're also transformed by those landscapes receiving fresh waters from the tributaries that flow into them. And we see this in her work. With Hinduism, for example, we see the declining significance of the deities of the Vedic period, such as Indra and Varuna and Soma, and the rising popularity of Shiva and Vishnu and Shakti in the first millennium. We see the emergence of temples, the sculpting of icons, new rituals of worship, revealing an amazing dynamism in the tradition. And this continues right on to the present day. The third point I want to highlight from history is the fact that the religious traditions of India have not existed in isolation from each other. They did not exist as fortresses, but they existed with porous boundaries, communities interrelated and interdependent. And they're full, we have a lot of examples of mutual influence and connectedness narrated by Audrey. Ashoka's rock edict, 12, condemned those who praised their own beliefs and denounced others. The Muslim Emperor Akbar, foreshadowing contemporary interreligious practice, invited scholars, including Jesuits, for religious discussions. And as she pointed out, Akbar supported a translation project that included Hindu texts like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The Ellora cave temples in Aurangabad have carvings side by side of Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist figures, and the shrines of Sufi saints like Nizamuddin Auliya and Muhyiddin Chasti attracted people from a variety of traditions, of course, including Hindus. Quite recently, I read a wonderful newspaper account of an event at the Madurai Meenakshi temple that celebrated an annual Chittarai festival, when the icons of the temple are taken out in procession through the streets of Madurai. And members of a local mosque stood on the streets to offer cold drinks and sweets to the Hindu devotees and to the temple priest. The temple priest in turn presented a garland to the mosque leader in front of the mosque. I found this to be a contemporary story, but one that also duplicates what happened in ancient India. Without exaggerating the realities of history, it is fair to say that India largely enjoyed a culture of hospitality to religious diversity, mutual acceptance, and tolerance. There were indeed, as Audrey's work points out, painful periods when history was wielded to enforce beliefs and to abolish religious freedom. Truschke notes, for example, the Emperor Aurangzeb, destruction of some Hindu and Jain temples, including the Vishwanath temple in Varanasi, the tax he instituted on non-Muslims, and the execution of the 9th Sikh Guru, Guru Tej Bahadur, in 1675. In Goa, the Portuguese Catholics unleashed violence against followers of other religions, and for over 250 years implemented an inquisition to persecute and punish deviations from right teaching. Painful episodes like these in the history of India did not succeed in displacing the deeply established tradition of mutual respect and the acceptance of diversity. The celebrated Hindu warrior leader Shivaji from Maharashtra forbade harm to mosques and to the Quran. He treated the text with respect and gave copies he found to his Muslim followers who served in his army. It is this long tradition of Hindu congeniality to religious diversity that made it possible, I want to suggest, for India to choose a secular state after independence. Pakistan, for example, formed after partition in 1947, chose to become an Islamic state. India chose a secular state. And I want to say that, suggest that that was because that kind of value for diversity had deep roots in the Hindu tradition. But it was a secularism with a very distinctive flavor, unlike the French or American versions, the latter under significant stress today with the rise of Christian nationalism. Indian secularism did not aim for a radical separation of religion and state. The ideal is a state that equally favored all religions, or what Gandhi spoke of as sarva dharma sambhava, equality of feeling or disposition towards all religions. But in recent times, this Indian version of secularism is under stress. It is being challenged. And these are challenges, at least from two, I want to briefly identify two sources of these challenges. The first is what many see as an inequitable application of the principles of secularism. And these include the retention of personal law by minority communities. So for example, although there's a general principle that the state must not interfere in religious affairs, there's an odd situation that continues in India where state governments are authorized to manage and control the assets of Hindu temples. So let me give you a really interesting example. You may know of the Ramakrishna mission, one of the most important contemporary innovations in the Hindu tradition. So we had an odd case where the Ramakrishna mission, founded by Swami Vivekananda, petitioned the courts to be designated as a non-Hindu group in order to be free to manage their own assets. Because if they were a Hindu group, then the state has the right to manage. So those kinds of disparities cause tension. But the more difficult stress that I want to emphasize, which Audrey discusses in chapter 21 of her text, is the rise of the ideology of Hindu nationalism, which I see as the most significant threat to the secular pluralist democracy in India. I could go into a lot of detail in this, but time doesn't permit me perhaps in comments. I can do that. And this is particularly the ideology as enunciated by Vinayak Damodar Sarvarkar in his book Hindutva, where he defines what he considers to be the criteria for Indian identity. And it is a definition that privileges the Hindu majority identity and marginalizes Muslims, Christians, particularly those two communities in India. They are treated as aliens, as not because they don't practice a tradition that he considers to be an indigenous tradition. They don't meet the criteria for inclusion in this definition. And this I see as a significant challenge going forward. So to conclude my remarks, with the rise of Hindu nationalism, we see for the first time, I believe, the use of religion as a criteria for national belonging, which India rejected at the time of independence, but now has resurfaced as a significant issue. Only those who belong to religious traditions that originated in the Indian subcontinent qualify. So Hindu nationalism, in a strange way, now begins to mirror more the kind of Muslim nationalism that we associate with the establishment of Pakistan, and also the contemporary movement of Christian nationalism in the United States and elsewhere. It makes the claim that only Hindus, defined by the norms of Sarvarkar, can be truly Indian. And so it problematically equates Hindu nationalism and Indian nationalism, and so continuously calls into question the loyalty of Indian Muslims and Indian Christians in India. So looking ahead to future history, I see contests and challenges and choices in at least two important areas. So first, there is an ongoing contest about what it means to be Hindu. And the contest is between those who narrowly identify the religion with Indian nationalism and those who embrace its openness, the diversity, its vision of a single human family, its universality. So that's an ongoing, what does it really mean to describe oneself as Hindu? And this is now being contested at a very fundamental level. And the answer to this question, I think, is related to where I see the second important question. And that is the meaning of India as a nation state. This is the difference between those who see religion as critical to the definition of national identity and those who affirm plural identities and believe that one's way of worship, one's dietary preferences, one's cultural practices should not determine one's right to belong. So you can see how the contest about what it means to be Hindu is related to what the Indian state should look like. So future historians, perhaps Audrey herself, will write on the outcomes of these contests, but it is my hope, sincere hope, that the version of the Hindu tradition that celebrates diversity and inclusivity and advocates for justice and for human dignity and the equal worth of all human beings will prevail. I hope for a state that overcomes the we or us and they divide, a state that is hospitable to plural identities and in which fidelity to one's religion is not seen as intrinsically antagonistic to one's national loyalties. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anant. Put a lot on the table. We have chai. I mean, this could go on into a late evening. Let me introduce our second panelist, R. David Coolidge. Dr. David Coolidge is research faculty at Mahan Islamic Graduate School. He has authored 2 books, The Beautiful Surrender. That's the title of his first book. The Beautiful Surrender, Islam as a Path to be Walked, is an accessible guide for believers, and his more recent, hot off the press book, Hindu Bhakti Through Muslim Eyes, Islam and Chaitanya Vaishnavism in the 21st Century, which is a refreshingly sincere attempt, and I'm inferring because I was just handed the book, but because I know David, I'm sure it's a refreshingly sincere attempt by a devout Muslim to constructively engage one branch of the Hindu tradition. Professor Coolidge has served on the boards of various American Muslim nonprofit organizations, including Zaytuna College, where I had the privilege to work closely with him when I was there about a decade ago, and he reminded me that our last encounter on a panel was about 20 years ago with our friend Yasir Qadi, so we need to keep meeting every 20 years like this. Please join me in welcoming David Coolidge.
Assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon all of you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to everyone who organized this, and congratulations to Professor Truschke on this enormous accomplishment. I would like to begin by reading you the opening lines of the book. Indian stories are continually retold, and I follow that grand tradition by narrating afresh nearly 5,000 years of human experiences on and near the subcontinent. This history matters. In modern times, a quarter of humanity lives in South Asia. For the rest of us, our lives are shaped by South Asian cultures, from the films we watch to the spices that flavor our foods, to the clothes we wear, to how we exercise, to, for many, the religions we practice. In brief, South Asia and its myriad traditions are critical to the human experience, and so we all ought to know a bit, maybe more than a bit, about the region's history. So the framing of my remarks comes from the Quran. The initial revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace and blessings be upon him and his family, that goes like this. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. Read in the name of your Lord who created humanity from the clinging clot. And your Lord is most generous, the one who taught by the pen, taught humanity that which they did not know. Taught by the pen that which humanity did not know. In the Islamic tradition, at the very beginning, according to all of our sacred imagination, is the remembrance of this beautiful tradition of writing books and sharing knowledge across generations, which of course for the Muslims puts the Quran as a sacred text, as the preeminent example, and so therefore throughout the centuries people have committed the entire text to heart. But at the same time, it also refers to every other book in human civilization that is meant to carry forward this knowledge to each and every subsequent generation. And so Professor Truschke's book in that opening section ends with the line, "After all, we are not the end point of history, and soon enough we too will be part of a far longer past." So these stories are being retold again and again in each generation, and it will continue after every single person in this room is no longer here, present on planet Earth in this bodily form. And these stories will continue on, and continual generations will look back and ask themselves similar questions that we are going to be discussing for the rest of our time and already are discussing. And so what is at stake in that particular telling and retelling? Well, I would like to posit that the concept of truth, that is a transcultural concept, is one that we need to put at the foregrounding of our conversation. Satya, haqq, truth. This idea that there are things that are true, and we may disagree about them vehemently, but it doesn't mean that we don't believe that there's a truth. There may be a secular truth, there may be a Hindu truth, there may be a Muslim truth, there may be a Sunni truth, and a Shi'i truth, and an Advaitin truth, and a Vaishnava Bhakti truth, and a Roman Catholic truth, and a Protestant truth, and so on and so forth, right? But the search for truth is something that this endeavor reminds us of. And from the Muslim perspective, this opening verse of the Quran reminds us that the idea that is encapsulated in the hadith, the narrations mentioned from the Prophet Muhammad many, many times in our communities, that wisdom is the lost property of the believer. The idea that the Muslim mindset is not simply restricted to the revelation of the Quran and to the actions and to the statements and to the historical memory of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is the core, that is the foundation. But wherever Muslims have gone, they have embraced the new reality that they find themselves in as, and I'm going to use a specific term from the Islamic intellectual tradition, the hukm takwini, the creational command, the fact that all of this that is happening here in our worldview is happening by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no power, there's no might except by Allah. There's no reality except by Allah. There is no possibility, there's no humanity without Allah. Rabban nas, ilahan nas, malikan nas. The Lord, the King, the God of all human beings. And so when we read this book, and I'm specifically coming at this from someone who teaches a course at Bayan Islamic Graduate School called Beni Adam, the Islamic Perspectives on Human History, to try to integrate our immense tradition we have is called universal history, such as books by Tabari, that's probably the most famous, Ta'arikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, the history of prophets and kings, which is essentially the Muslim version of the Bible. It's the big picture story from beginning to end. But the Bible's about this big, and Tabari's book's about that big. And we have many, many books like Tabari's book in the Islamic intellectual tradition that talk about past peoples, Persians, Indians, pre-Islamic peoples, Jews, Christians, right, as part of the story that we tell ourselves as Muslims. And so when you're reading this book, have that spirit of pre-modern Muslim civilization that said, all of this is important. When I'm reading about Ashoka, I'm reading something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the transcendent Lord of humanity, brought into existence. Right? It's not their history. It's our history too, from a Muslim perspective. That is what it means to say Muhammad Rasulullah. To believe that Muhammad is the messenger of God to all humanity has to be reflected in our attempt to rise above our own parochialisms and embrace a universal perspective. And so someone who's dedicated their lives to studying the traditions and the details and the languages and the sequence of events that have taken place over 5,000 years in one of the most densely populated places in human history, I believe, and this is what I teach in my class, that a Muslim should approach that all as relevant, all as something that is important to know. Now, there's the need for specialization, as Professor Truschke can probably tell us more about vis-a-vis this book. Right? If you spend all your time studying Sanskrit and Urdu and Farsi, right, you're not going to study Chinese, and you're not going to study Portuguese, and you're not going to study French. You're going to have a specialization. So for us, this is our textbook, right? And she's our teacher. But that means that we have to integrate it into our larger worldviews as human beings. And this is something that we all do, regardless of what we call ourselves as a matter of faith. Jew, Christian, Muslim, secular, humanist, doesn't matter. We all face this existential reality of integrating this information into our being and then trying to make it coherent. And then having that coherence guide us in our daily lives, right? That now that I know this information, even the unsettling parts, where do I go with it? What do I do with it? And as a chaplain at Brown University, as a chaplain at Dartmouth College, and as sort of an adjunct professor and an assistant volunteer chaplain at New York University, I had to do this many, many times with students from many, many different backgrounds. Watch them integrate new knowledge into their being. But even if we're 40, 50, 60 years old, we can still do that. Right? You can still teach an old dog new tricks, as we say in the English language. Right? And so for all of us coming to this text for the first time, I encourage you to do so with an openness and for a search for truth, as reflected in the quote of Malcolm X, rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah have mercy on him, when he said, I'm for truth no matter who says it, and I'm for justice no matter who it's for, who it's against. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. It's time for our round table or rectangular table conversation between the panelists. We'll go for about 30 minutes. We don't have to force it, but that's what I imagine, and then that'll give us just over 30 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So let me begin by asking Audrey, is there anything that you've heard from David and Anant that you'd like to immediately respond to? And
Sure.
Let's make sure this is on.
Is it? Hello? No.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
There you go. I'll turn mine off. Put one at a time.
All right.
Is it on?
I think, yes. Sure, so I can respond sort of briefly. So thank you both for your remarks. It's both gratifying and really interesting to hear your quite different, I think, responses to the book. So I think for Anant's comments, I have a couple of different reactions. As Anant points out, I spend a lot of time in the book on religious history, and I have a religious studies background. That was my undergraduate major, so that's like coming out a little bit there. And of course, for all of this, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we historicize religions, right? And there's obvious kind of problems and tensions that can arise when a historian tries to put a religion in a historical narrative, right? I mean, the chief one being that most religious people, in my experience, there's something about their traditions that they want to think of as timeless, right? As sort of the way it's always been. There is nothing timeless or unchanging for a historian, ever, right? I agree with Anant that I think we can sort of like bracket that by just saying that historians are not theologians, and you can't expect us to act like them. But I will just say another issue that I faced when historicizing various religions in the book was trying to explain their attraction to people. And that is a historian's question, right? There have been a lot of people that have espoused various ideas over time, and most of them did not amass followers that then founded a religion that survives hundreds or thousands of years later, right? So what made the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, so attractive? Why did people follow Guru Nanak, right? These are questions that I asked. I sort of got out of this with Islam, since Islam begins in the Middle East, so that was a little bit beyond my purview. But in trying to answer these questions, I did run up against this issue that if you stick with sort of a straight historian's account of the facts, right? Like, what do we actually know about the historical founder of Buddhism and Sikhism, respectively, right? These religions are founded about 2,000 years apart, but we have the same issue for both founders. We don't actually know that much about them. We know roughly when and where they were born. We know that they said some stuff, and then they died. And when I tell the story like that, it doesn't explain why people followed them. And so for both figures and numerous other religious figures in the book, I actually transitioned to hagiography, right? Which is the historian's term for what people have believed about these figures, but we cannot prove, all right? Hagiographies, typically around a person's life story, they allow for elements that a historian cannot admit. For example, in Guru Nanak's sort of like founding kind of moment when he realizes the Sikh religious truth, he goes into a river and stays there for 3 days and then reemerges, right, with his sort of like insights that become the foundation of Sikhism. Obviously, in hard history, there's no going into water for 72 hours and coming out alive, right? But as a point of hagiography, that's very powerful, right? It marked him as, you know, a special person, someone who can do non-ordinary things. And so what I do for both figures, I tell for both of them the straight story, the facts and nothing but the facts. It's like, you know, 3 sentences for each. And then I tell their hagiographies pursuant to explaining what people believed about these men and why they found their religions attractive to make their own and keep as their own over time. So Anant ends with 2 questions, right? What does it mean to be Hindu, and what's the meaning of India and changing meanings as a nation state, and what does this look like going forward? And I'm not going to answer those questions, but I am going to say that, so as a historian, the closer we get to our own time, the harder it is for me to do my work, I feel. And as some of you will know, I've actually written about modernity in our times quite a lot, so it's not like I don't do this, but especially in a book that covers, you know, centuries, millennia. By the time I got to like the 21st century, I was sort of like, oh my gosh, it's too close. Like, I don't have the historical distance I need to see what's important and what's not, right? A lot of historians deal with this by just ending their books at earlier points, right? A lot of historians in my position would have ended with partition, for example, right? That just beyond living memory, basically now. I chose to go until about 2020 because I wanted to keep the book relevant, but that means that I did come up against points where I wasn't sure. Basically, I didn't know what I wanted to say, right? So for example, I talk about the founding and the initial articulation of Hindu nationalism as an ideology, but I can't really say anything about where it goes from here. The whole thing could collapse like a house of cards next year, right? Or it could remain the defining political ideology of India for the remainder of my life, which I hope is very long. I simply don't know, right? So you do part of the, I don't know, for me, part of the recipe of the book was knowing my limits and knowing when to just say, I don't know. On David's remarks, so I love your response to the book, David. I think it's really beautiful in many ways. I think I have less to say about it. Just for me it's not a spiritual thing, right? Which is not to say it can't be for other people, right? Do what you want to do in history. I think it's all good. But I do think it's really interesting and compelling that for you felt like you could sort of, I don't know, move in between or somehow transfer over that line from objective history into sort of internal spiritualization and kind of what that means for you, right? I think that part of the promise of history is that it means different things to different people, right? And that doesn't mean we get to reinterpret the past as we like it. We don't want to do that. But it does mean that it can sort of look a little differently in all of our lives now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. That was really great, and we're going to have to learn how to turn our mics off and then on whenever we're speaking to avoid the echo. So I'm going to ask maybe a few questions from each of the panelists, and we'll go maybe do a couple of rounds of that. If we get to 30 minutes or less, if it goes longer, I'll cut off. But let me turn to Anand. In the chapter on inequality, pleasure, and power, which was chapter 7, we see how ancient texts can be completely at odds with our modern sensibilities. And this is, I think, Audrey alluded to this, with the sublime and the horrific can go together, and indeed must go together, perhaps. They're connected. At one point, and all religions have this problem, if I can call it a problem, including Islam. So I'm not singling out any one tradition. At one point, Audrey writes the following in reference to the Dharma Shastra works circulating in the 1st century. And here, so she gives a warning, like a trigger warning. And here I advise the reader to steel herself for some severe review, for some severe views. And then she goes on to describe what the texts say. And I leave the views that she writes about to your imagination. If you're really curious, get the book. They're on page 122. The question is this: how do we remain faithful? And what is the point of referring to the past for inspiration when we have so much in our text that we would rather forget? By what criteria do we determine that we are remembering the right things?
Mahan, you don't ask easy questions.
If there's anyone who can answer it, it's you.
You have much more confidence than I have in myself. So one of the features of the Hindu tradition, as Audrey mentioned, I also mentioned, is that it's a very diverse tradition, internally complex and diverse tradition, with many texts that are considered to be sacred and to have religious status and significance, perhaps more than any other tradition in our world. So in order to arrange what might be the really authoritative and significant text and what might have less authority, there's an ancient formula that we use. And in Sanskrit, this is the distinction between the Shruti text and the Smriti text. So in the chapter that you referenced, Audrey writes in a very particular way about Manu's text. So Manu is Manu Smriti. So his text is classified as a Smriti text. And the word Smriti means that which is remembered. Shruti is that which is heard. And Shruti is almost, in this classification, almost used exclusively for the Veda. So in trying to make sense of this diversity of texts, the formula is that the Shruti text, which corresponds more closely to what you might regard as revelation, and the Smriti text is a humanly authored text that is contextualized, has significance in a particular place and a particular time, but not regarded as authoritatively significant as the Veda text. So Manu is very clear, as you showed in your discussion. Manu advocates for caste. Manu's text is very patriarchal. in nature. So if you considered Manu to be authoritative, you would be also advocating for caste hierarchy and patriarchy even today. But since Manu is Smriti, we could say Manu is reflecting thought at a particular time in history, but which is not authoritatively valid for all times and all places. So that gives us some space to deal with unjust social systems that might be in a text like Manu. Actually, in that chapter is the one place she cites my work. Now, what is more difficult, Mahan, for all of us, is what do we do when in the text that we consider to be revelation, the Sruti itself, you might have teachings that are caste supportive or even patriarchal. What do you do when in the revelation itself there seems to be verses that might not be, doesn't treat every human being with equal dignity and value. Now, I can tell you what I do with those texts, how I approach that in my own work, because it's a really serious and difficult matter. Now, what is interesting from the Hindu perspective is that we don't speak of the Veda. Veda means knowledge. Sruti means that which is heard. Heard in the sense of originally from the divine, revealed words, and then transmitted by word of mouth, orally from teacher to student. So we don't speak of the Vedas so much as a text, that bound text, but more as a teaching that is received from the divine and transmitted. So you have this teaching, but then we're given these principles. You mentioned the word criteria in your question. What is the criteria that you use to sort this all out? So traditionally, we have a double criteria. So you might have a lot of material in the sacred text. I'm using the word text, so it's interesting. Scripture, the word in Latin means that which you read. Sruti means that which you hear. So you can see the difference. So let us say in the Veda you have a variety of teaching. But what you have is an acceptance that not all of these teachings are authoritative. One is that the actual scope of the authoritative text is very narrow. Where it is authoritative, it is very narrow. It is authoritative only where it gives a teaching that cannot be known through any other source. That's why I said the sacred text is not meant to tell us history. History is the business of the historian. So the sacred teaching is authoritative only where and insofar as it tells you something that you cannot know otherwise. And in this case, particularly the nature of God. The nature of God. That is his primary authority. And second criteria is, it is authoritative only insofar as it is not contradicted, or it does not contradict what you know to be true from other sources of knowledge. So one great commentator said, if 100 verses of the Veda tell you that fire is cold, you cannot accept it as true. Because you know from all of your experiences, if you put your hand in fire, it will burn you. So you have to ask, why is the scripture telling me? You can't take it literally, because it contradicts what you know. So the scripture is authoritative where it tells you something that you cannot know otherwise, either through perception or inference or any other source of knowledge. And secondly, if it does not contradict what you know. So I'll give you one example and I'll stop. If a scripture says, for example, that women are not qualified to read the Veda, as some Orthodox believed, they were excluded from being students of the Vedas. Let us say you have a verse says, women are not qualified to read the Veda. So we have to ask, why is that so? Is there any, does that contradict empirical evidence? Because we can argue women are as intelligent as men. They have the capacity for learning and scholarship. So that kind of sentence, that kind of claim will be contradicted by what we know about women from our direct knowledge of women's abilities and capacities. So we cannot consider that verse to be authoritative because it is contradicted by what we know from another valid source of knowledge. Or if a scripture says, look, people are only qualified, I'm talking about caste now, people are only qualified for certain kinds of work on the basis of birth. And then you have examples all around where people have diverse capacities for all kinds of work. Then that teaching will be contradicted by what you know empirically, therefore it can't be considered to be valid. So I use those two principles, especially in my work on Hindu liberation theology, to deal with such kinds of texts and to rigidly apply those principles in determining as criteria to determine what is worth preserving, as you said, and what is not.
Well, as I said, if there's anyone who can answer this question, would be Anand. And this, this panel here is now a historically informed and theological conversation. So we're going to be going back and forth. I'm going to turn to David and try to be just a little bit brief so we can get through maybe a couple of rounds. David, you published your own book just this year. Congratulations. Here it is in my hand. When you look at Hindu Bhakti through Muslim eyes, which is the title of the book, what do you see? Do you see two nations, Hindu and Muslim, fundamentally at odds with each other, such that they must either be separated or in some kind of conflict? Or do you see something else, something relatable and even harmonious across Islam and Hinduism, to put it broadly? How would you like your Muslim sisters and brothers to approach Hinduism in all its complexity? How do you understand the two-nation theory? That's the big question behind this. Audrey argues compellingly in her book that the origin of this two-nation theory lies in the colonial era, when the British began to use labels separating Indian from Indian by applying categories of exclusion in ways that Indians never did before. But she also refers to Al-Biruni, who when he marched into India with Mahmud of Ghazna way back in the 11th century observed that the people of India differ from us in every respect. What say you?
Just to be very clear, my book is about the present and the future. And so I put the history chapter about the history of Chaitanya Vaishnavism third, because I argue that what I want you to see is that it is a living tradition that is growing, that from the moment of Chaitanya, who disappeared from this world in 1533, until the 1960s, it was only in South Asia, particularly in the Bengal region, in Braj, which is in Uttar Pradesh, near Vrindavan, well-known city, and also in Jaipur, another center of that. In the 1960s, it became a global tradition and is only growing. And the largest denomination of this tradition, which is called ISKCON, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, is building this massive temple in this town of Mayapur in West Bengal. So when my initial reaction upon seeing it was like, this is like a Hindu Vatican. Like, that was my thought. That's an unscholarly thought, but that's my initial raw reaction. And then as I went to visit it as I was finishing the dissertation, which is the foundation of this book, and it got me to thinking, because they have an incredibly long time frame that they think about. They think about Kali Yuga as beginning 5,000 years ago, this traditional historical dating system in Sanskrit text, beginning 5,000 years ago, but they got 432,000 years left to go, of which now that this particular tradition is, since the time of Chaitanya, is like a 10,000 year golden age. So from their historical perspective, they can wait 1,000 years to see how this plays out. And if you understand their theology, there's no need for them to like convert everybody, right? Like they can just grow and grow and grow, and there's no problem. They can diminish, they can grow, it doesn't really matter, right? But they're building this absolutely huge temple complex in Mayapur in West Bengal to be their global headquarters and to be literally like a beacon to the world the way that the Vatican is for Roman Catholicism. So how do I know that not 1,000 years from now, Muslims will be talking about them the way they talk about Roman Catholics? Right? It's one of the dominant religious traditions on the planet that is incredibly organized and now has a Chicago Pope. And who knows, if the guru successions, issues related to that particular denomination will be as interesting to Muslims as the election of a pope is, right? But part of the reason the election of the pope is interesting to Muslims is because Roman Catholicism has been one of the most dominant religious traditions in human history, and arguably one of the most successful NGOs, as Michael Cook says in the book Brief History of the Human Race, which I teach. And so, this goes back to what Audrey says about we're not the end point. How do I know that 1,000 years from now there will be 1 billion Chaitanya Vaishnavas and 2 billion Muslims, and Muslims will be like, okay, we really just got to deal with the Chaitanya Vaishnavas now because they're like our main religious rival or something like that. The past does not necessarily determine the future. And so when I look at this, like for example, as a convert to Islam, there's so many points in which the Indian Muslim experience has sort of hit my own experience, and I could talk about that ad nauseum. But I'll just say, as a senior at Brown University, studying with Muhammad Qasim Zaman and Donna Wolf, who's esteemed, he was a sort of historian of Islam and esteemed scholar of Chaitanya Vaishnavism. And I wrote my thesis about, and I wanted to write about Muslim perception of the Hindu tradition, and that's how I discovered al-Biruni, who Mahan wrote his dissertation at Yale about. And when I read al-Biruni, I was like, yes, 1,000 years ago, a Muslim wrote an amazing book about the Hindu tradition, and one day, I'll kind of like add a new chapter to that story. And that's all this book really is that al-Biruni was amazing. But he lived 1,000 years ago, and so he's a product of his time, and I'm a product of my time. So I read about Chaitanya Vaishnavism, right? And so what I say all this to say that these currents of history that we're living through right now, we try our best to get the universal position and the universal perspective, to really understand the whole thing. But 1,000 years from now, people will look back at us and say, oh, they're so myopic in their own little issues and so on and so forth. And I think that the history of South Asia is a continual testimony to the fact that there's an enormous range of perspectives, an enormous range of political formations, an enormous range of economic realities and cultural realities at play that are continuously making us confront our smallness in human history. And I was thinking of another verse of Quran as we were talking earlier, وَلَوْلَا دَفُ اللَّهِ النَّاسِ بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ. Right? It says in Surah Al-Hajj, if God had not sort of played one people off against each other, then as it goes on to say, then churches and temples and synagogues and so on and cloisters would be, wherein God's name is praised, would be corrupted. And for 1,000 years, that's been the reality in South Asia. Nobody really has the upper hand. There have been moments back and forth, right? When it seems like someone has the upper hand, like Aurangzeb had control of huge territory like Ashoka did, but then as the chapter says, his children started fighting, his grandchildren started fighting amongst themselves, and next thing you know, the British had it. So who knows what things are going to be even 100 years from now in terms of the political formations that we look to. I mean, in the United States of America, we sort of pride ourselves on having the oldest living constitution in the world. Who knows if the Constitution of the Republic of India will outlast the United States Constitution in the long run? God knows. I don't know.
Okay, that was great. You gave a very, very interesting answer, but it was not the answer to my question. And so,
No, I avoided the two nation. I don't want to touch the two nation theory.
So I'm going to rephrase it. You don't have to answer it. I have one question for Audrey, and I'm not going to do the second round. Then we just open it up to the floor. So my follow-up is, and I'm going to direct it at you, David, just to give you another chance. But here's where I'm coming from. There's such enmity, hatred, that's now prevalent between Hindus and Muslims. And I'm glad that a lot of people here saying, I don't know if you said yes or no. I see some nodding heads and I thought I heard no. But, and the rhetoric that I grew up with, that I still hear, is we are different people. Hamara uthna, baithna, khana, pina, sab alag hai. Like we're completely, we can't sit together, we can't eat together, we're two different nations. Yeah, we should respect each other, but from a distance. Which seems incoherent to me a little bit because there are 200+ million Muslims in India. And I'm asking you, like, from your study of the Hindu tradition, how do you relate as a devotional believer of Islam in a brotherly way to Hindus? And can you help the audience understand that a little bit? That's
Sure.
yeah.
When I, as a sort of student of the history of Islam, I see this in Islam. Barelvis and Deobandis hate each other's guts, right? Like that was, they both speak Urdu. They're all Hanafis. They study the Sharh of Taftazani and the Creed of An-Nasafi, right? And yet they still fight with each other, right? You would think that if being a similar makes people get along, then the Deobandi Barelvi split in South Asia is sort of testimony to the problematic nature of that statement. Because what human beings do is they create patterns of inclusion or exclusion on all sorts of bases, right? And so, like for example, in my book, I argue that I'm willing to say, I believe that there's 8 madhabs based on the Aman message, for example, sort of affirming that idea. There's the 4 Sunni schools, and there's the Jafaris, and the Zaydis, and the Ibadis, and sort of the Lahiri Salafis. And those are 8 pre-modern legal traditions that exist in the modern world, and there's an orthopraxic unity to them that I think is really powerful. And I try to explain that in the introduction to the book, right? But then there's going to be somebody who comes along and says, no, there's only 4 madhabs. Okay, well, I have a more inclusive version of Islam, and you have a more exclusive version of Islam. So I also argue in the book that I believe that it's very significant that the 3 pre-modern forms of what I call devotional theism, are the 3 dominant religious communities in the world today, of those who believe that the earth was created by a willing, seeing, hearing being, right? Vaishnava, Hindus in particular is the ones that I focus on in the book, but obviously other Hindus as well, Muslims and Christians, right? And Buddhists are the other 4th largest religious community in the world. And so that idea that they share in that devotional theism is very powerful to me. Because when I, for example, even meet an American convert to Chaitanya Vaishnavism who's immersed themselves in the study of Sanskrit and the study of Bhagavad Gita and so on and so forth, I see patterns that are very similar to my experience of converting to Islam and coming to believe in the theological claims of a pre-modern religious tradition. And so for example, when I talk about Vaidhi Bhakti, which is the orthopraxic element of the Hindu tradition, of the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, I use examples of actually white converts from the 1960s who are explaining, oh wow, this is the first time I ever read the Bhagavata Purana, and I feel like God is speaking to me, which is exactly the way I felt when I read the Quran, right? And so yeah, I'm not them, right? Their tradition is different than my own. But I can see myself in them, and I can see that their struggle to make it through the process of conversion, for example, is similar to my struggle of the process of conversion. And if there's anything that the history of South Asia is the testimony to religious change. How do you have so many religions all across South Asia for thousands of years. It's because everyone was there and people were changing their religion. Yet everyone believes that we were always this way. We were always Hanafis. We were always, following this school of thought. But as Audrey said, every generation is changing. Every generation is either choosing to reappropriate tradition or to carry on the tradition or to abandon the tradition and to make it exclusive or inclusive on their own bases. So it behooves us, and I'm an advocate for creating models of inclusion intra-religiously and inter-religiously that are authentic to who we are as individuals at the same time that they're authentic to our traditions themselves. And whether we succeed or fail, previous generations will judge us, and for those of us who believe in a God, our God will judge us too.
All right. That was just beautiful. There's a lot there to talk about, and I hope we have time to unpack it at some point. Now, let me just turn to Audrey. I'm going to ask you one question, and then I will open it up to the floor. So, you write that pre-modernity forms the core of the book, and this, you explained that also in your remarks, and you resist what you call presentism, which, if I understand, you can also correct my question if I didn't understand something correctly, which is the projection into the past of what we want to see from the present moment, rather than what was actually there. And so the historian's task is to somehow kind of filter out and be as objective as possible and find what a historical truth, rather than project onto it narratives that are really shaped by the present. At the same time, you affirm that viewing the past honestly is the best way then to contextualize present trends. And so what the book does then is it doesn't really talk about the present, but it gives us the ability to talk about the present in a more informed way. All right, so one present trend that the world has never seen before is climate change. And you allude to this as well. So there's something unprecedented that's happening. With that in mind, my question is about the Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan, which you note, and you mentioned this in the book, remains in effect today and demonstrates the benefits of cooperation. So this is the sad part of scholarly labor, especially in history. And when you come too close, I think one of the perils is we now are in a situation where the treaty has been suspended after the Pahalgam attack, which I alluded to in my opening remarks, for the first time in history. And Pakistan is assessing this to be an existential threat. How do you see, with all of your historical work, the present moment? Are we in unprecedented times, or do you think this too shall pass?
This is a small question, right? So, I hear you. I think definitely the pace of climate change and the human element in it is unprecedented. South Asia's had climate change forever, right? But what we're seeing now is obviously something very new. The day, what was it, a month or so ago, 2 months, I don't know, time gets ephemeral. When I read the news about India suspending the Indus Water Treaty, I immediately thought about that bit of the book. I was like, man, it's not even out, and already it's a little outdated on that. We can hope it comes back. We can hope it goes back into effect, but we'll see. And I should say, I end the book with climate change. That's sort of the ending point. And that's because, historians generally, we really don't like to project into the future, despite Mahan's question. But the one thing that I think any historian would feel pretty comfortable saying will be a major feature that shapes subcontinental life for the next several decades or more is climate change, right? Like that much is clear. How do I see the present moment? I think a lot of what I see, and I want to be very careful here, because it's so important to us now, and it's important to me too, right? Like when you're living through it, like all the political back and forth, it really matters, like individual events really, really matter. But I honestly see a lot of things that no one will talk about in 50 years, right? I mean, that's just sort of how it goes. I certainly see a lot of things that just aren't that new, right? Like I wonder, and Mahan sort of talked about this in his introductory remarks. I mean, this most recent flare-up over Kashmir, unless something more happens, I don't know that that's gonna be more than a footnote in the history books someday. And yet, it was a huge deal to probably everyone in this room, right? And so, our lived experiences are not always reflective of what history will ultimately judge to be the major trends. And I think that's something that can be hard to think about. It can almost feel like a devaluing, right, of our lived experiences, and it's not meant to be that. It's just that historians think about things a little bit different. Moving forward, I will say this, right, because one of Anand's questions was sort of, what's the meaning of India as a nation state? I'm still not going to answer that, but I will say that the nation-state world will end one day, right? Every other political system we've ever had has ended. All individual states that are around today will also end. That is the sure end of every political formation. India, Pakistan, the United States, all of it will someday cease to exist as we know it. And I don't think that's going to be tomorrow. Right? Don't get too worried. I don't think I'm going to live to see it either. But it is, in the longue durée of history, a foregone conclusion to me, right? Everything that we think is so important and that shapes our lives and that's real to us and that we hold dear, someday it'll be just a memory. But that said, we don't get to jump forward in time, right? Unless I'm missing something, somebody let me know, right? And so, to some extent, it can be nice to dream about the future sometimes, but we have to live through our present, right? And ideally try to make our futures a little bit better. So hopefully my book can give some fodder for helping folks do that.
Wow. Yes, and this is why I said there's some, she won't acknowledge it, but I think there's something deeply spiritual about viewing history in this longue durée and humbling yourself as sort of an episode, a moment in the future's past that may be forgotten very soon. With that, let's open up for questions. President Gianotti, another hand in the back. Do we have a microphone to pass around?
Dr. Marcia, too.
And Dr. Marcia. So Rebecca is going to walk around. You pick it.
Oh,
You can start.
he needs his headphones.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank all of you for a really thoughtful and stirring panel. And I hear echoes of the Neem Karoli Baba in your Islamic theology there, David. That's really interesting. But my question is really, I think, between Anant and Audrey. We're talking about lots of contemporary political questions, but I really, the question that kept resurfacing for me throughout the evening is the whole idea of indigeneity. In a world where there is, as you mentioned, Anand, so much porous dynamism and likening religion to a river and not the rock. I think that was a beautiful analogy or simile. But I think that this is an interesting question, and I'm wondering if you think indigeneity, which might be connected to a sense of authenticity, especially when we're talking about political theology and the notions of the nation state. But is indigeneity a question for the historian, or is it a question for the theologian? And so, because to me it's obviously in the subcontinent, as it is everywhere, it's a deeply complicated question. And I think it comes to the root often of these manufactured nationalisms some sense of indigeneity is connected to that sense of authenticity of that notion of the nation state. So I'm wondering if it's a historical question, is it a political, like is indigeneity a political concept? Is it a historical concept, or is it a theological concept?
So we're going to take 3 questions together and then brief responses so we can get as many in. So go ahead, Dr. Marcia.
Yeah, thank you all so much, and thank you for your work, Audrey. My question is actually a little bit related to indigeneity, but a little more concrete. I used to really like, I have a confession, I used to really like the Indus Valley civilization theory that there were Aryan invasions and that explained the caste system and that explained why there were Indo-European languages and European languages are so similar to Hindi and Urdu. And then all of a sudden it was like, no, there was no Aryan invasion and this didn't happen. It seems to me, I would like to hear from a historian because I'm not a historian, what is the current sort of objective understanding of the Indus Valley civilization, and not why it collapsed, but sort of how this piece fits in there of this commonality of the Indo-European languages. And I always felt there was a kind of pushback, like it was indigeneity, like there was something, no, everybody was always Indian, and the Indus Valley civilization was completely Indian and there were no outsiders who came in and made this big difference. So can you explain that?
Thank you. And there was 1/3 in the back, and then we'll come to you in the next round.
I'm sorry.
So we've got 2 for the next round. And 3.
Thank you. My question might be just a little bit basic. It's something that I ponder on a lot, but I obviously want to, I'm not a historian, like Dr. Marcia said, that I'm not a historian either. And so just wanting to get your perspective, and this is open to anyone on the panel, but if the partition didn't happen, so between India and Pakistan, what do you think the Hindu-Muslim relations, tensions, would look like?
Okay, I think we'll go with those. So we'll start on.
There we go. So thank you for those great questions. Starting with migrations. So I actually start the book with how people got to the Indian subcontinent. Nobody's indigenous if you go back far enough, all right? That's about 120,000 years ago is the original peopling of India. India is, just based on geography basically and where it's located, sort of like prime real estate to migrate into, right? Also, India was basically synonymous with wealth in pre-modernity, right? It was the land of rivers and spices and fertile farmland, so people just kept coming. There are very few constants throughout all of South Asian history. Migration is one of them, all right? In terms of the Aryan migrations, invasions, right? So the old theory is the Aryan invasion theory. We've gotten rid of that, but the Aryan migrations are very real, okay? There is nearly ironclad linguistic evidence behind them. This has nothing to do with the Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley civilization is first. That's usually thought of as an indigenous civilization. We really don't know who these people were, but they were around the Indus River in what's now Pakistan, right? And then a little bit south into the Gujarat coastline as well. They rise, they build cities, they flourish, and then they fall. Then a few hundred years goes by, and then the people who called themselves Aryans came. Now, they migrated in, there's no evidence of particularly violent conflict. I'm sure they killed some people, but they largely warred amongst themselves. The Aryans were not united. It was a clan-based society. They spent a lot of time rustling each other's cattle, among other things. I don't use the word Aryan in the book because of the Nazi associations, all right? Aryan's a very old word. It's over 3,000 years old. But the Nazi thing really, it just confused people. So I talk about the Indo-European speaking migrations and the Vedic migrations. And those are the folks who bring Sanskrit, they bring an Indo-European language, sorry, let me correct myself, that becomes Sanskrit. Once they get to northern India, that then becomes the source for all Indo-European descended languages in South Asia. That includes Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati, and Urdu as well, all right? They're not the last group of migrants. There's plenty of other migrants over time. I agree with Timothy's point. I think indigeneity is a political football right now. I don't know how long you have to be somewhere until you're from there. In the book, basically by 3 generations, I sort of give it to you, right? So that's how I do it. In terms of the partition of India and Pakistan, so it didn't have to happen. Many people think that partition was some sort of like long moving, like centuries in the making. It really wasn't, right? The idea of a partition was really first floated in 1930. That's less than 20 years before it happened, all right? That said, I have no idea what the subcontinent would look like without it. I don't think any of us do, and that's partly because it's not just that there wouldn't be India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, right? It's also that in like 1 million or so people that died during the partition violence, they would have lived, and they would have had children, and who knows who those people would have been and how they would have changed our world, right? This is a counterfactual that I don't feel super comfortable running.
Thank you for all the wonderful questions that, as Mahan said, we can go on for a long time with this discussion. So I think, Dr. Tim, that the question of indigeneity could be answered from a historical perspective, but I think the question also has theological significance. So today in India, I mean, as part of the Hindu nationalist ideology, the tradition of Islam and Muslims and the tradition of Christianity and Christians are considered non-indigenous. And from that argument is then used to say that the followers of these traditions don't belong as those who come from so-called indigenous traditions. So there's something very problematic in the way in which the indigenous argument was used by Savarkar in his dissertation on Hindu nationalism. Now, but if indigeneity is really a lifting up of the beautiful particularity of traditions, then I think that there is something very constructive and meaningful in that. In the sense that as a Hindu theologian, as a Hindu practitioner, I learn much more profoundly from those places of difference, or the difference that I encounter in other traditions. That is where I have my deepest learning, where your tradition is telling me something new about the nature of the divine or what it means to be human. If we're all saying the same thing, there's not much to learn from each other. But in those places of difference is where there's a great depth of learning. And so we don't want to move to some space where we seek to homogenize our differences. But our differences should not be divisive. They should be deep places of mutual learning and places of respect. You know, there's a very ancient text from the Rig Veda, in Sanskrit, ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti, that the wise speak differently. The different ways of speaking are not because of ignorance, but the wise speak differently, therefore listen. Be attentive. That could be a place of profound learning. You know, Mahan, I felt that you raised a really important question that went to my heart, and you know, it is one of my deep concerns. And this was the question that you posed to David, to which David responded. And this is a question about Hindu-Muslim relations. What would have happened if we didn't have partition, as Audrey says, we don't know. But what we do know is that partition has left a lot of wounds, unhealed wounds, wounds that are still bleeding on both sides. And my question is, how do we go about healing those wounds? Because those wounds have to be healed. As long as the wounds are bleeding, our communities will be in tension and even in violence. So I wanted to say that there is a responsibility in both communities now to move to ways of healing those wounds, because those wounds belong to the past, but they continue to inject themselves into our present. And as long as they do that, we're going to be on the brink of violence and conflict. And I feel, Mahan, that we who live in the United States here, as Hindus and Muslims, and who have made this land our home, I hope that we can see our lives together here in shared communities as a wonderful new opportunity to build relationships among Hindus and Muslims that are not governed completely by what happens on the subcontinent. That our voices here can be voices for peace. Our voices here can be voices for healing. Our voices here can be voices for reconciliation. That we don't simply mirror what happens in the subcontinent, but we say, look, here in the United States, as Hindus and Muslims, with the rich differences of our traditions, but living in shared community, we can, I use the word, we can love each other. We can care for each other. We can be compassionate to each other. We could have reverence for each other. We can see the sacred in each other. And wouldn't that be a wonderful message for not only for Hindus and Muslims, for our world? I think that we can do that.
Yeah. Thanks for that heartfelt response and engaging the previous question as well. We had maybe 4 hands up. Let's take the 4. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3, 4.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Audrey. Good to see you again. A few years ago, I attended your book talk on Aurangzeb. It was awesome, too. I heard you talking about the hatred between Muslims and Hindus. I was taken aback because I grew up in India, in Hyderabad. When I was growing up, it was a beautiful secular country. When we went out, we were not Muslims or Hindus. We were one young youth who were all Indians, and we loved being Indian. Lately, I've been seeing not only in India, around the world, Muslims are at the receiving end of the hatred. I have traveled India and Middle East. I haven't seen any Muslims hating a Hindu passionately or a Christian or anything, but today's world, in the so-called democracies, I see the hatred of Muslims is the trump card to win elections. Unfortunately, it has come even to our US democracy, Trump talking about Muslim hatred and winning elections. Same thing happens in Indian Modi. They use Muslim hatred to win elections. But when you go to Saudi, it's all Muslim countries or any Middle Eastern countries. We don't see any hatred towards anyone who are non-Muslims. It's just like in today's world, the hatred of Muslims, and it's becoming the trump card to win elections. And then these are just sham democracies when you are surviving and thriving on the hatred of a community. And when I travel everywhere, like we went to Delhi and other places, my husband would be so scared to talk about anything communal and express that we are Muslims because the tax driver, because Delhi is very communal too. So everywhere I've seen Muslims in India living in fear. When I was growing up, it was never like that. My cousin, she lives in Bombay. They are so scared living in Bombay as Muslims. So that's the whole point, like, when will it end? Why is it that everyone's using Muslim hatred to win in the elections, and
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, yeah. That's true. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the panelists, and guest speakers, and professors, and the organizers. These are really important issues that people really need to get more exposed to. My question is actually related to the indigeneity question, which is the argument by nationalists, religious nationalists in India, is that Muslims, Christians, or outsiders coming from Central Asia to conquer and take over territories. But based on the migration theory, it appears that both the Vedas in their oral transmissions, but also the language Sanskrit also stemmed from Central Asia. Is there some irony in the fact that the origins of Hinduism stem from Central Asia, yet they claim that Muslims and others are also from Central Asia? So what is the counter-argument to the migration theory where they posit that Hinduism and Vedas are indigenous to India, as opposed to the current theories that exist in academia and by historians?
Thank you. And then we have
This one.
1 and 2. So
There's
we did,
also one
yeah.
First I want to second what sister said there, that when I grew up in India, I've been in this country almost 60 years. I grew up with Hindus like we never felt any different. All my friends, even to this day. And if I can go back to my grandfather and all that, even Hindus have lived in our family, and they've made sure to let them have their way of food and everything. My grandfather would not eat until she gets the food from outside. That's how, and we still have connections the same way. So yes, this is the more later phenomena, and it has been promoted now. So my question actually, partly, I was going to ask what Azam asked just now, but Hinduism term itself has been used, Hindus and Muslims. Now, and Professor Anand said his version, and he said it's multiple things. So actually Hinduism term itself is not indigenous, as far as we know. So that, lumping everybody into one and calling Hinduism that, in fact, the lower caste in a big number, they themselves claim they are not Hindu. But the people who are in control, they always want to say everybody is Hindu, So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit, Professor Anand, in fact, that how can we say, everybody other than the Hindu, Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians are Hindus? I'd like, throw some light on it.
Thank you. This gentleman here.
Thank you. I traveled about 2 hours to come to this meeting, and it was well worth it. Had I traveled 20 hours, it would have been well worth it. So my question is for you, sir. Savarkar's teaching were based on indigeneity, it's a hard word to pronounce, if I'm correct. I don't know much about it. How did it resonate with the local Hindu people when there is no rooting of that philosophy in the Hindu theology? And how does it still garner support when it is, if anything, contrary to the Hindu theology?
Okay. This is the last round, and I just see that one hand, so we'll take that final one, and then a closing round of responses.
I'm not sure if this was answered already, I came in a little bit late, but historically speaking, and anyone can answer it, what is India? What historians, how do they wrap their head around something that's so, there's so many different factions? Is it language? Is it geography? Is it religion? Is it food? Because from historical perspective, how do we answer this question neatly that this is the idea of India? If you could touch on that.
Oh, you have to get the book. So this is the final round of responses. So I'd like you to respond to anything that you like, but also make it your concluding remarks. And we'll go down, should we end with you, Audrey? But you can respond first and then maybe a final word.
That works.
Okay.
All right, so thank you all for the wonderful questions. In no particular order. Well, I'll try to do this more or less, I guess, in chronological order. Let me start with what is India. I use the term in the book in its sort of fundamental geographical sense. Historic India. That is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan. Right? So it's that land that's occupied. As to what unites it, nothing. There is nothing that unites all of it. I actually don't think it's a great idea. In fact, I think it's a pretty bad idea to write Indian history in this fashion. I mean, I know I shouldn't bash my own book, but ideally we would have enough interest in South Asian history that we were writing the history of Gujarat and the history of Karnataka and the history of Kashmir, and these were separate. This is not the market reality of what people want for South Asian history right now. We all teach, well, maybe you guys don't, I teach South Asian history courses at Rutgers Newark. We need something to teach, right? And we need just an entry point for people, educated readers who are interested. So that's sort of what India means. The post-1947 meaning of India, that's very new for a historian, right? It's only been 80 years for the Indian nation. I agree that there is an irony about arguably one of the origin points of Hinduism being external with the Indo-European speaking migrations. That said, I think an important point is that Hinduism has multiple origin points, right? It's not like a continuous line from the Vedas until now. I mean, the Vedas are one starting point, but then we also have when, vegetarianism starts to take off. That's not much of a concept in Vedic times. We have when we start to see Hindu temples rise. That's a little bit less than 2,000 years ago. Again, not a Vedic thing. What about yoga? Some people think it's Hindu, some don't. In any case, definitely not connected to the Vedas. This is true. Is there a way to fix this?
Your mic might be on.
This is true with other Indian religious traditions as well, right? People do this with Indian Islam sometimes. Like they try to draw a line from Muhammad bin Qasim in the early 8th century all the way down to partition of Pakistan. Yeah, that doesn't work either, right? There's multiple origin points. I will say, so Savarkar was actually into the Aryan invasion theory, like emphasis on invasion part for him. Okay, he was really into the idea that Hindus were this powerful group that came in from outside and completely dominated the native peoples of the subcontinent. This is a rare point on which later Hindu nationalists have departed from B.B. Savarkar. All right, so modern Hindu nationalists just deny any Aryan invasions or migrations without historical evidence. The last thing I'll comment on briefly is sort of like, why is Islamophobia like the great uniter of haters of the world right now? I mean, there is a history of Islamophobia. It goes back, centuries in the West. In India, it really is tied to Hindu nationalism, right? Like it is the core of Hindu nationalism. Sometimes people think of Hindu nationalism as sort of about a Hindu identity predominantly, and then, oh, by the way, they hate Muslims. It's sort of the other way around. Like hating and oppressing Muslims is the absolute core of Hindutva ideology. There's no Hindutva without it. I will just note as a corrective, many Middle Eastern nations are fairly intolerant of other religions, including Hinduism.
Thank you. Yes, would you like to, Anantanand?
Just some very quick, very quick responses to the question in the interest of time. How did Savarkar's ideology grow into popularity? I think it did so when it took organizational form, especially with the establishment of RSS. And RSS, the ideology of RSS is really fully the ideology of Savarkar. So I would say a very brief response that this ideology took roots when it gained organizational forms with the RSS, and then of course RSS allied political parties. The most recent version of which is the BJP. When the BJP came into power, one of the first things they did was to put up a portrait of Savarkar in the Indian Parliament, right opposite, in fact, the portrait of Gandhi, when Savarkar was implicated in the assassination of Gandhi. So the political institution gave this ideology a lot of a lot of its power and a lot of its roots. You know, someone astutely observed, and it grows also because it has the, unfortunately, you know, a lot of, I think as our sister was pointing out that as well politically, it rallies people together on the basis of identifying and telling us a narrative of a common enemy. Because Hinduism itself is such a diverse tradition, is a family of traditions. So what Hindu nationalism does is to unite Hindus, not on the basis of any shared theological ideas. It is not so much a theological movement, so it has to find some point of unity, and it does so by identifying a common enemy. In this case, of course, as we know, the Muslim community of India becomes the common enemy. Take that away and the other thing has nothing to, as you said, nothing to stand on. So hate, in a sense, is the fuel of unfortunately, the fuel of the. I was going to say, you know, one astute observer of India said, part of the problem is that you have a Hindu majority numerically, but with a minority mentality. That thinks of itself as a minority. I think there's a lot of truth in that statement. And just a final comment on the question from our brother here. I mean, of course, it's quite true. You know, the word Hindu itself is a geographical term. It has its origins in the name of a river. So it was not used initially to identify religious belief and practice. People who lived on the territories drained by this Indus Sindhu river were derivatively called Hindu. So it was always a very diverse tradition. What is unfortunate with the Hindu nationalist movement is that the term also is used in quite an imperialistic way, because it seeks to include Sikhs who don't want to be called Hindus. It seeks to include Jains who increasingly are also resisting that, and it includes South Asian Buddhists who are also resisting. But because it has some numerical political advantages, you know, they're all classified as Hindus. Muslims and Christians are not. So it is, in the Hindu nationalist ideology, it has taken on this imperialistic. It is wrong to impose an identity on people who do not want that identity. We should respect Sikhs who don't want to be called Hindus because they have a distinctive religious tradition. And so with the Jains and Ambedkar Buddhists and others. I think there's quite an unfortunate. It's better to admit, you know, the diversity of the traditions and to grant people the freedom to define themselves. My final comment is that, as I said earlier, that what Hindu nationalism has done is to equate Hindu nationalism with Indian nationalism. And not to recognize that nationalism can take various forms. And I hope, and I didn't mean to ask Audrey to look into the future, but it is my hope, and it's really only a hope, that the traditional value for diversity, in the contest that I spoke about the contest about what is Hindu and who is a Hindu, I hope and pray that the Hindu tradition that has a historical value for diversity, hospitality to diversity, is a tradition that will win out. But who knows? The battle is a very, very serious one.
David, would you like to add? Probably the last word.
So I'm married into a Konkani Indian Muslim family for the last 20 years and come from the village of Giriya in South Maharashtra. And I have the honor, I assume, of being the only white guy who's ever prayed Salatul Jummah in the Giriya Masjid twice. And, you know, the sort of family lore is that, you know, they pray like Shafis, right? So, you know, the Indian Ocean trade system, the Shafi madhab spread throughout the coastal regions, and that's why, for example, Malaysia is predominantly Shia. So I thought of that on page 155 when Audrey wrote, "From Arabia, Islam spread rapidly, especially east toward India. Within a century of there being Muslims on earth, members of this broad-based religious community had reached the subcontinent. Like many before them, early Muslims came to India primarily as traders and merchants." So no one knows the history of the family and the history of the village of Giria with any sort of detail. It's not an administrative center of Muslim rule or Hindu rule. It's a sleepy village on the coast, farming shrimp for generations, growing mangoes for export now. But who knows how many centuries go back of people making salat towards Mecca, from this sleepy place. And then fast forward, perhaps all the way back to the 700s. God knows best. No, I have no idea how to trace that. But fast forward to page 443 in 1940, when Maulana Azad became the Indian National Congress president, he declares, "I am a Musliman and I'm proud of that fact. Islam's splendid traditions of 1300 years are my inheritance. I'm unwilling to lose even the smallest part of this inheritance. I'm proud of being an Indian. I'm a part of the indivisible unity that is Indian nationality. I'm indispensable to this noble edifice, and without me, this splendid structure of India is incomplete. I am an essential element which has gone to build India. I can never surrender this claim." From the 700s, coastal traders, to 1940. That's longer than my family. That's more than twice as long as my family came from England in 1630 to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is more than twice as long of a history. So if I'm indigenous, if I'm an American, how can a Muslim not be an Indian? So I'll leave you with that.
All right, lovely. Well, it's time to bring this to a close. I wanted to close just by referring to something that the book closes with right at the end with Fahmida Riaz's poem. I'm not going to read the poem, but she wrote it while she was in exile in India. And she had fled Pakistan, being persecuted under the Islamization policies in the 80s. And when she got to India, she landed kind of in the arms of the Hindutva movement. And so she wrote this poem saying, "So it turned out you were just like us." It's a great poem, but I'm going to do a theological spin on it and reread it in my own way, in a hopeful way, which means, so it turned out we're not all that different after all. And I think when we see the humanity in each other, when we learn to re-remember by sitting back with a broader gaze of history, the gift that you've given us with this book, perhaps we can move towards healing. So now please join me in thanking this wonderful team. A couple of quick announcements as you go. One, summer classes are starting at American Islamic College tomorrow. There's two you can still sign up for. Omar Muzaffar's class, he's a chaplain at Loyola, and he's teaching a class, Islam Today in a Troubled World. If you want to take one class on Islam, this is it. Check it out. Also, Azhar Usman is teaching a class on the rise of Muslims in Hollywood, changing the script. That starts tomorrow, and the first class, it's online, but the first class he's teaching in person at 1 o'clock at American Islamic College, and that's open to the community if you want to experience it. A lot happens behind the scenes to put a program like this together. So I'd like to thank Michael Ford and his colleagues Muhammad and Ketura and the entire team at Roosevelt University for giving us their space. The staff at AIC for providing rides, security, arranging the food, and especially the AV, and especially to security and Romana Manzoor for coordinating all of it from behind the scenes. Rebecca Go, my partner in crime at the Ansari Institute, for liaising with our guests and making sure that they made it to Chicago. Rashid Ahmed with the Indian American Muslim Council for participating in all the planning and contributing generously. Thanks to all of you. Now get some cold samosas and pakoras and buy the book. The Consul General wants to say a word.
Oh, we forgot. Thank you so much. It was very enlightening discussion. As a student of history and comparative religion, all were great scholars. I would just comment or maybe just would add that your chapter on Indus Water Treaty, climate change, won't change besides its so much seriousness of this issue. Legally, no party can actually alter without the consensus of the both parties. So Article 12 of the Indus Water Treaty clearly says that it cannot be changed by one party. I also really appreciate that you talks of this region, not a homogeneous region, because in the 5,000 years of history, there have been almost negligible amount of time when it was one unit. It has been maybe hundreds of it, thousands of units. So I think there was a question about partition. It cannot be projected as something that actually altered so much. And I would say that we moved a bit, but then there was a talk about Hindutva and the problems inside. But I would say that this emergence of Hindutva as a regional peace and security implications, and that would be a long discussion, but I really appreciate what you said, but I would think that it would be important to cautiously observe what's going on in the region. And I think the peace and security and mutual cooperation is important, and that's what Pakistan's talk. And when we hear about the things from the leaderships, eat bread or you have bullets or like these, I mean, these are not service to. So I would say that the sanity would prevail, but this was really very, very interesting and very great discussion. Thank you so much.